And so the idea of this panel is really to bring to bear both the academic and practitioners' perspectives, looking at the impact of border restrictions on a population that we have identified earlier in today's discussion so far, migrants and refugees, who oftentimes are one of those groups most at risk of some negative impacts of some of the border policies. So I'm going to get things kicked off by inviting Audrey to make a few comments.
Thanks so much, YY, and it's a pleasure to be on a panel with all of you. Greetings from Toronto. I want to just begin by making 3 points, some of which I develop in my paper. And I want to begin by talking about the way in which the pandemic altered what I call the functionality of international borders. This morning, we heard a lot about both the effect or lack of effect of border restrictions on slowing the spread of the pandemic within certain jurisdictions, and the kind of rise of, for example, provincial borders as mechanisms for suddenly mechanisms for halting movement into jurisdictions. So I want to step back for a moment and say that prior to the pandemic, our understanding of what international borders do relates to stopping the movement of non-citizens across borders in ways that allow for the state to scrutinize them, evaluate them, judge them, filter them. And this is against a backdrop where once on a territory, people enjoy a relatively capacious liberty, where you are nowhere more powerless, if you will, than at a border. But once you step over that border and you're admitted into the country, you enjoy wide forms of liberty and certainly freedom of movement. So what changed in the pandemic? Well, a couple of things. One was that the border remained a mechanism of closure and immobilization, but suddenly so did the interior of the state, right? So inside the state, a region previously understood as one of free movement suddenly became a place dedicated to immobilizing people. And that was a change. So you saw interprovincial borders springing up, curfews, all sorts of mechanisms designed to stop people from moving, and the use of coercive power to do that. And so suddenly, within this kind of pervasive form of immobilization inside the state, where citizenship was almost irrelevant to how the state was going to evaluate movement. And I mean for formal citizenship, not the substantive citizenship that I think the previous panel was talking about. But now, under pandemic conditions, where the goal is to really stop everybody from moving everywhere all the time, right? Border control between countries now appears less distinctive and simply more like one of many mechanisms of an apparatus devoted to halting the circulation of people. Now, it's true that in ordinary conditions, and generally the technology of border control is designed to maximize coercion and minimize accountability, and one shouldn't trivialize the violence of that. But it's worth noting that under the pandemic, border control was not so much about a migration objective as much it was part of an infrastructure of controlling movement that was not primarily about immigration. It was about protecting public health. The same objective shared by this suite of domestic measures that we were all talking about this morning: quarantine, lockdown, social distancing, internal travel restrictions, mobile app tracing, right? And in this sense, the border changed because it was set against a different landscape than it was before. It's now about pervasive control or immobilization, and that's new. The second point I want to make is that the pandemic kind of temporarily jostled the usual hierarchies that we associate with migration control. In the name of serving the needs of the state in the course of a pandemic, the hierarchy of people who are going to be admissible was jostled a bit. So, for example, normally, the state ranks so-called high-skilled above people who are so-called low-skilled. Well, suddenly essential workers were required in all sorts of occupations previously designated as low-skilled, and they were ranked more highly. Their entry became more important. Permanent migration is ranked more highly than temporary migration. Again, during the pandemic, there was great a lot of movement toward admitting temporary workers quickly. Family migration is ranked below economic migration, but there was political pressure brought to bear to enable the family reunification of people who otherwise would not be ranked very highly on that kind of grid of admissibility. And so the pandemic jostled that hierarchy. I think one group who remained at the bottom were refugee claimants, asylum seekers, right? And in this case, their position in the migration hierarchy did not change much. And in fact, the government, I think, took advantage of the pandemic to actually intensify restrictive measures against them. But the last point I want to make is that this is applying at the border. Inside the border, what we saw, again, probably temporarily, was a kind of facilitation of transition from temporary to permanent that was unusual, right? So, and it tracked this kind of jostling of the hierarchy of migration and the redefinition of who was essential. And so during the pandemic, we saw the emergence of a temporary or a regularization program for a very small number of refugee claimants under what was known as Les Anges Gardiens, the guardian angel pathway, a very small program specifically directed at refugee claimants who were performing frontline service in care facilities for individuals who are typically patients or elderly people. We saw another pandemic pathways program for transitioning certain people from temporary to permanent resident status, again, on the basis of more or less performing essential services, or also for being international students who were employed. And the last point I'll make about that then is that we saw these short-term pilot projects. There is an interesting and open question now about the current government's intention to develop another regularization program not animated specifically by COVID or the pandemic. And it will be interesting to think about whether and to what extent the regularization initiatives taken during the pandemic have shaped, can shape, should influence the direction of regularization of non-status or temporary migrants going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Next, we will move to Lou. Can you make about 5 minutes worth of remark?
Absolutely. Thank you, YY. Thank you for the invitation, and thanks to my co-panelists for sitting today with me and the attendees. I will make 3 points for my opening remarks. And before I do that, I will say that I'll be talking about healthcare workers in the context of the pandemic. Healthcare workers will also, at the same time, migrant workers themselves, and are seeking in the two-step migration process that Canada has enamored itself to in the last few decades to become permanent residents in Canada. So one thing I want to underscore, and that I did underscore in my paper, was the phenomenon of deprofessionalization, which has already been studied and back and forth by a lot of scholars, including by folks like Philip Kelly over at York University. It is a systemic problem that has pre-existed the pandemic, but it has been amplified as a result of problems relating to border closures, which is the topic of this conversation. And I'll get to that when we get to YY's first question later on. The other point that I'd be talking about at this point would be credentials recognition, which is definitely tied to the phenomenon of deprofessionalization, and it remains a painful bottleneck for a lot of migrants who are already having to deal with their two-step migration to Canada. Despite efforts from both the federal government and the various provinces, and we're seeing top-down approach programs at the moment from premiers such as Premier Ford or Premier Kenney, both in Ontario and Alberta, launching scholarships, for example, to help healthcare workers who are in Canada to get their credentials recognized, essentially to become either nurses or registered practical nurses, for example. There are still a lot of bottlenecks, and it has to do with a lot of the regulatory requirements. And the fact is, in the last few months, there's been a lot of pressure. There's been a lot of press, and might I say, a lot of negative press, basically trained on the certification bodies in Canada. And I think there's a lot of lessons that needs to be underscored, where the bottlenecks are, where the systemic problems are, and dare I say, perhaps systemic racism that exists in these particular licensing processes. So there are lessons learned and to be learned, and we still have to have an honest conversation with ourselves. Canada needs to do some soul searching. First of all, we need a more nimble licensing regime. That much is clear considering the massive healthcare worker shortage that we're still kind of like in the middle of, and kind of the author of it is ourselves. So on top of that, we have to look at other countries and how they actually not really solve, but address the problems. Comparative approaches are always welcome. For example, I would highlight the example of France, where they not necessarily solved it with one swoop. However, they took care of the precarity aspect of a healthcare worker's status and two-step immigration process by making 12,000 healthcare workers citizens in a stroke of a pen. Why is it that Canada can't do that? And why is it that the temporary pathways that Audrey hinted at earlier on, why did it feel like an obstacle course for a lot of folks? Why is it that we can't do something simpler for them? And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion in this panel.
Thank you. Will?
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm feeling very grateful to be here as alumni of the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. I've been in Anishinaabe territory, a visitor from Coast Salish territories. Back on campus. My conference paper is titled Spouses of the Pandemic, Data, Racism, and Mental Health. And it really weaves together the idea that COVID-19 saw restrictive policies such as immigration and border entry controls being applied to spouses of students and skilled workers. And that the data itself suggests there was some discrepancy between the way that global South applicants and global North applicants were being treated, and that the government policy and data can only tell us a portion of that story. And in fact, with the data, as I've presented in my paper, there are a lot of gaps. There's not a lot of proactive disclosure or disaggregation being provided by the government, and we have to paint our own picture for ourselves. And in that process, I'm finding it like digging with a shovel in a pail. In response, I present three counter narratives from an Indian applicant with a spouse named Amit, who is a work permit holder in Canada working in the tech industry. She's being barred by the Indian travel ban from coming to Canada. We have a Nigerian applicant whose spouse Ola is in the process of applying for permanent residence, but is delayed in Canada, also a worker and unable to see the birth of their newborn child. And then I also talk about a Pakistan citizen who's a residence holder in the UAE, whose spouse holds a study permit in Canada. And all three of them share this unique experience of racism and mental health challenges that they're experiencing. So in my paper, I present a case of concern because I see Canada through the pandemic stepping towards this period of data-based decision-making, largely through artificial intelligence and the use of advanced analytics. Simultaneously, however, they seem to be putting very high standards on social science evidence, on the social science evidence that is required. And there's not much room in an applicant's process, especially if they're a temporary resident who has no right of appeal, and then the courts themselves have put limitations on the evidence they can present and put very high standards on tests such as bias. So where can they raise these issues of mental health and racism? So I argue that coming out of the pandemic, we actually need more social science. We don't need less. We need new anti-oppression frameworks to rethink things such as the GBA+, inputting critical race theory, having an independent ombudsperson to ensure data access and to put out social science evidence proactively. And ironically, through all this, the government has actually increased behind the scenes the use of social science evidence, global reports, rankings, ratings, intrinsic evidence to make decisions. However, this has been very non-transparent. So in my view, the COVID pandemic has really strengthened this color line and color divide between the global South visa requiring countries and the global North's largely visa exempt countries. And how we move through that entrenchment will be really important moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So I actually that transitions quite well into the first question I have for the panel, which is to invite the panelists to give us a bit more a fuller picture about how the various border restriction measures that Canada has implemented during the COVID-19 pandemic, how has that affected the population that you either have studied or work with? And so, Will, can you start us off?
Yeah, I mean, let's just start a little bit with numbers because I think it's important to see the whole volume. So total decisions for spouses of students and workers, the ones I studied in my paper, fell by 61.8%. And refusal rates rose, especially for spouses of students, 9.41%. This is between 2019 and 2020, essentially the implementation of these policies. And then temporary resident visas, which is the big way that a lot of family members come into Canada to reunite, that falls by 81.2% between 2019 and 2020. So you really have a less decisions being made, less applications being processed, and an increase in refusal rates. Ironically, though, for many of the global South countries, even coming out of 2020 to 2021, these refusal rates are not going back to pre-pandemic levels. So that gives the question of whether it's actually, the pandemic has given further reason to maintain these rates, or if it's the pandemic themselves that were the cause of the rates. So in reality, a lot of family separation, mental health crises, questionable differential treatment based on national origin, and a lot of what my fellow co-panelists were talking about, what Derek Bell might coin interest conversion, where there's an effort to facilitate some agricultural food workers, students who pay tuition, essential workers, but then you're refusing their family members, refusing permanent residency for compassionate grounds, refusing to essentially set up a pathway yet for undocumented workers and seasonal agricultural workers for permanent residence. So I saw a lot of that during the pandemic.
Great. Audrey and Lou, do you have anything else to add on this question?
I can add something about refugees and refugee claimants. So refugee admission through resettlement pretty much ground to a halt entirely during the pandemic. Refugee claimants who would otherwise enter by air also pretty much ground to a halt because of the kinds of criteria on air travel, and the heavy restrictions on them made it virtually impossible for anybody to travel. So that left really only one category of refugee claimants who could reach Canada, namely those who would enter across the land border with the United States. It is the case that Canada's approach to movement across that border was slightly less restrictive than the entry of people directly from other countries. It was still pretty restrictive. But we have, as maybe some of you know, a safe third country agreement with the United States that, with some exceptions, precludes refugee claimants who are in the United States from entering Canada to make a refugee claim in Canada and vice versa. That means they cannot enter through an ordinary port of entry. Over the years, and particularly during the Trump administration, more and more people who would be, many of whom would be refugee claimants, entered from the United States to Canada irregularly across a land border. There were a couple, one in Manitoba, one in British Columbia, but most notably one in Quebec, Roxham Road. Not an official port of entry, but it became commonly known as a place where people would enter. It is not against the law for people to do that if they're refugees, and Canada wasn't stopping them until the pandemic. When the pandemic struck, although there was certainly public controversy around that. So once the pandemic struck, the Canadian government actually halted that entry and pushed people back to the United States. This was something that some people read as opportunistic, because initially the government said that people who were refugee claimants could enter on the same terms as all those who were accepted from exclusion would enter, which is to say they would have to quarantine. There was no indication in March or whatever of 2020 that that system did not work or would not work as well for refugee claimants. But suddenly and without explanation, about a couple of weeks or a month later, the government simply halted that and prohibited and pushed back refugee claimants seeking to enter across the border at Roxham Road. It did so without offering any explanation or justification for why they could enter even as the government was facilitating the entry of other people whose entry, for whatever reason, it deemed essential. I'll just make one more point, which is in response to Will's really detailed analysis, I would just add, in name, the government said that it was going to facilitate the admission of family members, even family members of temporary workers. And so, if I were describing the law, it would look like Canada actually made allowance for a family reunification. It's only, from what I understand, when you drill down into actual numbers and refusal rates that you find out that didn't happen in practice, at least as I understand Will's evidence.
Yeah, and if I could just take off on that point, and Will and I talked about this in a lot of circumstances, the dreaded 179B exclusion, that if you're from the global south, it's very, very difficult to overcome that in normal times. And especially in the pandemic, it sort of became an informal gatekeeping mechanism to prevent travel from even happening in the first place. I also want to highlight a couple of points in response to YY's question. One thing I would note on the two-step migration process for healthcare workers is that it's no big secret that we know that a lot of healthcare workers come to Canada through the caregiver program, and they become permanent residents through that particular program. What we know and what we discovered through ATIP requests from the government is that they practically suspended processing of caregiver applications for a very long time. It only started moving sometime in 2021, late 21 to 2022. In fact, an application that we filed back in 2019 under the old stream was only processed just last month, in fact. So there's really a slow resumption and slow uptick in terms of how to essentially treat these two-step applications. On top of that, those who are already temporary workers in Canada, who are healthcare workers, some of them have difficulty in essentially get their safe practice experience up to date. For example, in Ontario, you need to have done it in this span of the last 3 to 4 years, for example, and you need to have live credentials when you make an application to the College of Nurses of Ontario. And if you don't have that, essentially what you could do is you can do that in Canada, but at a cost. Usually you have to pay at George Brown, for example, if you're in Toronto, or you can go abroad, for example, back to your home country and perhaps work as a nurse there for a couple of months. And typically that takes care of it. And with the closure of the borders, that really prevented that. And that created another bottleneck, not just from an immigration standpoint, but also from providing fresh healthcare workers into the system, whether they be RNs or RPNs. And on the last part of this, I would say in terms of my files, I had a lot of family reunification file problems. And just like Will mentioned, I work with a lot of Global South passports as well. And what I've come to realize is that it was very difficult to actually get these folks, even if there were programs. As Audrey mentioned, on paper, it looked fantastic, looked like there was a way, a process. However, they were faced with a lot of problems. For example, if they don't fit the common law category, what would it be? Serious relationship, they did create that, but that kind of lets an applicant show their hand to the officer. That strengthens the pull ties to Canada, and it would essentially create 9B trap. So we need to think about the 179B provisions and the regulations in terms of family reunification. We need to reconcile these. Thank you.
Lou, can I just for those of us in the room that perhaps don't have such an in-depth immigration background, can you just quickly kind of explain what the 179B inadmissibility policy?
I apologize, everyone. Section 179 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations essentially requires an applicant to convince an officer that they would leave Canada at the end of their authorized period of stay in Canada as a temporary resident. And usually that creates an onus on an applicant to demonstrate that they have sufficient pull ties to their home country or their country of residence. So much so that when they're out of time in Canada, they will leave. There's enough incentive for them. And normally what we see is if you have a weak passport, the notion is, if you can't demonstrate it with good evidence anyway, it's going to be very difficult for you to establish that you will leave Canada.
Thank you. Okay, so let me pose another question for the panelists. Because as we know, even though we talked about these restrictive border policies and how they impact migrants, we also know that those policies don't apply to all migrants in the same way, right? So we know that, for a while, Canada would have hard border closures that applies to some migrants, as Audrey has mentioned, relating to refugees and asylum seekers. But then for others, there are exemptions, perhaps on the reason that they're essential workers. And also we saw a different treatment between those who are coming to Canada through the US border versus who are coming from other countries. So can we, what do you think of this non-uniform approach to the border policy and how that it's impacting the migrants? Perhaps I will invite Audrey to reflect on this question first.
It was interesting. I think this morning we heard about the gravitational pull between states as distinct from their proximity as the predictors of certain kinds of impacts. But of course, the United States is both of those things. It is both a strong gravitational pull in the terms that were used this morning, and it happens to be adjacent to Canada. And we know that, in fact, the first kind of transmissions cross-border were from the United States, not from further afield. Now, it is the case that the approach to border restrictions under the Quarantine Act had two prongs: the people coming from the United States prong and people coming from anywhere else. And the criteria for entry from the United States were slightly less restrictive than entry from anywhere else. But I don't know if I could say it was dramatically so. But to the extent that there, and I could explain more in greater detail what the difference was, but for present purposes, I think the explanation for the difference is surely about the economic strength of the United States, the dependence of Canada on US trade, all of the usual commercial reasons. And so that is absolutely the case, that the difference between the Canada-US border protocols and those from other countries are explained by the economic, political, and other force of the United States, at the same forces that actually also might explain why initial infections seem to come from there. The point about refugee claimants who are seeking to enter across the Canada-US border versus refugee claimants coming from any other part of the world, I explained in my comments in response to the previous question, so I won't repeat it here. Thanks.
Great. Will or Lou, do you have anything else to add up here?
I'll let Will add first if he has any.
I'm good on this question. You can go.
Okay, just a very quick point on this then, YY. What I did see is that definitely it accentuated the disparity in the power of an applicant's passport. For example, if they had a passport that allowed them entry to the US, they could circumvent a lot of the rules that thicken borders if you were to enter Canada by air. But that's a very privileged few. And for those who are visa required to even enter the US, first of all, most visa appointments at US embassies across the world, and still until now, actually, you still have trouble booking appointments for that. And for a time, it was completely suspended as well. So it did, to a certain degree, facilitate some entry, but it came at a heavy cost and a heavy burden to family reunification.
Thank you very much. May I just also take this opportunity to encourage those who are online and also those who are in the room, if you do have any questions, by all means, we're happy to kind of add that into our conversation. Okay, so next, I'd like to pose a question to the panelist, because we've heard about this earlier today, and I no doubt that we'll continue to discuss this point. That is, border policies in general tend to have, whether it's in terms of the way that it's implemented and its effect, tend to have xenophobic and racist aspect to it. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that that point when we're considering the border measures that's being implemented here in Canada during the pandemic.
I can start quickly, maybe. I think what was really interesting during the pandemic was you also saw, following the murder of George Floyd, a lot of institutions doing a rethink on their own anti-racism strategy, their own positionality with all these issues, and they started doing, internal employee audits. IRCC did one, CBSA did one, all of which, also brought forth racism as an internal issue that has had external impacts. And I think, just even from explicit policy, the Indian and Pakistan travel bans and the banning of the 10 African countries from November to December 2021, those had huge impacts on applicants. And, of course, there's the debate of whether it's good health policy or if there was racial animus in that process. But I think even the courts, and I wanted to highlight one court decision, the federal court in Dijakono, Justice Mosley, this is 2022 FC 584. It was about the access to virtual interviews in the Ghana visa office. And the judge made a statement. They argue, and the court agrees, that it's not consistent with the objectives of IRPA to continue to process applications from Western countries while applications in Ghana were left to languish. So this idea of unequal treatment. And I think technology and artificial intelligence is going to move that forward, because what is a low risk file? What is a easy to process eligibility approved file? It's likely one from the global north based on the criteria they're looking at now and the historical data. So it's the applications that are being left out that are going to languish and going to be delayed. So even delays now are a new form of racism in the system. So I wanted to flag those 2 points.
Thank you. Audrey and Lou, do you have anything else you'd like to speak on this point?
I don't have a lot to add. I mean, racism is baked into the structure of the global migration regime. It shouldn't be surprising that no element, no event, no contingency escapes that. So COVID, why would COVID be an exception to that? We should just expect to see those structures shaping and inscribing themselves on the response to COVID. It's kind of everywhere all the time. And so that's not to say that, so one of the interesting things here, just perhaps if I can just say one thing about this, is the way in which we celebrate Canada as this country of immigration and hold it up as exemplary of our non kind of racist ways, when, as Will said, a recent kind of, internal audit of the very institution that governs the implementation of our immigration laws is itself deeply imbued with precisely the kinds of racist, the kind of racism, racialization that we specifically hold it up to deny. I mean, you just can't get away from it.
Really good points. I'd like to speak to the purpose and the effect of, what Will mentioned was the banning of the 10 African countries. This was in the wake of the announcement of a new variant, the Omicron variant, back in December 2021. What that was truly in, I'm going to reference a bit of pop culture here, is Adam Conover's, argument about a security theater. Because at the same time, Omicron was already being confirmed in other countries where Canada had not implemented a ban, and it took weeks for Canada to actually pay attention to what was actually happening, say, for example, in Hong Kong. There was no ban, and yet you banned South Africa, essentially punishing a country that was an early warning system to this variant that would have taken over the Delta variant at the time. It was very bizarre. It coincided with the fact that it's an African country, and it's not a very good look, as Audrey put it. Canada tries to market itself as like this paragon and this shining city on a hill when it comes to immigration. And on one more point to that report, it was actually just a few days ago that A Radio Canada report came out that actually confirmed and surreptitiously placed into the government website that the minister himself, Minister Fraser, acknowledged that there was racism in the department, which is not really surprising, but to actually have it heard from the top of the guy who runs the department is pretty quite astounding in my opinion. Thanks.
Thank you. We actually have 3 questions from the audience. I'm going to start with Colleen, your and Mike.
A comment that's in responding to public health crises, whether it's, you know, like bloodborne or pathogens. Often what you see actually is conservative governments who want to keep borders open for economic reasons and without, you know, concern for the inhabitants of the population who are often racialized vulnerable groups inside the borders. So I think that's just something to think about when we look across states, who's been opening and closing borders and who was more likely to keep their borders open. I haven't done the analysis for COVID, but I'm going to wager that it's mostly conservative governments that are keeping their borders open. Not to say that the response of more liberal governments isn't racist in its application, but I guess there's racism and then more racism to go along. And then the second question is really for Lou and Will. You both mentioned this idea of fast tracking healthcare workers. And I know that, you know, we sort of live in our little bubbles of law and policy, immigration, and I'm in health. But I worry about taking valuable healthcare workers from countries that, you know, it's really difficult for them to train their healthcare workers. And then we are in a global shortage in every regard. And the common refrain I hear from everywhere, is that we should be taking healthcare workers from low and middle resource countries. And, you know, of course, from their own lights, they won't immigrate. I completely understand that, of course. But we're not talking about architects or plumbers. You know, we're talking about people who are really, you know, particularly physicians, take so much money and so hard to train. And we see a global migration around the world from poor to wealthy countries of those. So I just wonder how we should think about that then, because I can see again, you know, both sides of this knife.
Lou or Will, do you want to address that question?
Will, do you want to go first or should I?
You again, your paper's on this. Go first.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Okay, that was a very good question. Oh my goodness, it's got a lot of neurons firing, I gotta say. I will say that definitely the brain drain question is certainly something that I am always conscious about. What I will say as a first response would be that in Canada, you have a pool already, those who are already in Canada, you have a pool of healthcare workers who are not working as healthcare workers, at least in the front lines. And that is due to the fact that there are barriers, systemic institutional barriers that prevent them from getting their licenses. That if you were to transport them, say, for example, to the UK or back to their home country, or to the US, for example, they would have an accreditation process that is more nimble, that is more adaptive to what they actually are trained for. So it's not so much about the way I see it is that, yes, brain drain is a problem, but at the same time, there are a lot of potential immigrants who are already in Canada on a two-step process that we are not taking advantage of, that quite frankly, their home countries could take advantage of, but they couldn't because they're already in Canada. And Canada's kind of like, you know, in this striptease kind of like approach of like, come to Canada, become healthcare workers here, but no, you can't work as a healthcare worker. And I understand that that's a disparity between the jurisdictions of the federal government and the provinces, where professions are regulated at the provincial level. But at the same time, there needs to be tighter coordination when, healthcare workers from abroad, when they do come to Canada, that they're able to exercise that which they are trained for. Now, on the question of attracting new talent, that is truly something I don't really have a response to, but I will leave a couple of remarks. I'll cite the example of the Philippines during the time of the height of COVID, for example. This was in 2000. They did a deployment ban. Essentially, no nurses, even those who were nurses in Canada who happened to be stuck in the Philippines, who happened to be dual citizens of both Canada and the Philippines, they were not allowed to leave the Philippines in order to actually help as nurses in the front lines in the Philippines. So that is a question for global South governments as well. And I can talk about how the Philippines treats its own healthcare workers, and it's quite absurd and it requires a separate conference or panel on its own. But suffice it to say, the push factors are certainly there. And, at the end of the day, we also want to look at, and I think you did mention this in your comment, that we also want to look at the ability or the liberty of a person to choose where they want to be at this point in their lives for themselves and for their families.
Will, do you want to add something?
Sure. I guess the one comment I would say is something to look out for is also Canada during the pandemic still really emphasized on international students, especially the tuition money. In fact, charging Canadian tuition money to folks who weren't even in Canada studying, some of which never actually made it here. You're going to have a lot of folks actually return back to their countries of citizenship. And I think the idea of international student programs actually to support Canadiana abroad. So you will see actually, and I've had a lot of clients in the same situations, healthcare workers who couldn't find jobs, as Lou was mentioning, and had barriers placed on them institutionally from racism, want to go back to their countries of residence and citizenship to work in those areas. So I think it's a much more complex picture than sometimes we paint as Canada being like, the savior for all the individuals who want to come here. It's much more complex on the ground level, at least I would say. Would you agree, LJ?
Absolutely. Sorry, go ahead, Audrey.
No. I just wanted to circle back to Colleen's first question, but I don't want to stop if there's more to say about the second one. Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, Audrey.
So I think, Colleen, the first question you raised or scenario was that, in fact, it was conservative governments who might have been opening their borders and putting at risk particularly marginalized and disadvantaged people already in their communities. And I guess what I would say in response to that is really to go back to where I started, which is to understand that the role of migration control in the pandemic shifted to being one piece of a larger apparatus about immobilizing people in the name of preventing the spread of COVID. So if you understand it that way, then it's not really about whether conservative governments or other governments are just opening or closing the borders, but how are they using border control in tandem with all of these other mechanisms? And the mistake, it seems to me, is for any government to think of border control apart from those other mechanisms. So a conservative government that is only using border control and opening the borders while doing nothing to otherwise protect people in the country from COVID is certainly failing, but it's not a failure that I would say would be resolved by you should be stricter about the border as such. It's you should have a suite of things that you're doing. And depending on what the other conditions are, and I think those were explored this morning, are we in a situation where there's no vaccine? Are we in a situation where there is a vaccine? Are we trying to slow it down? What are we trying to do? Then you weigh and look at the function of border control in relation to that. But to abstract border control out of it is, I think, partly a mistake of applying a pre-existing understanding of what border control does to its new function as one of a suite of attempts to affect the progress of COVID through immobilizing people inside the country, at the border, and elsewhere.
Thank you. I actually just want to turn to a question that was posed online before I turn to more questions here in the audience. There's a question that's posed, and I'll just read it. It says, if you were, right, the panelist, if you were in charge of defining the categories of exemptions from international border restrictions during the pandemic, how would you define who's included and who's excluded, right? What kind of exemptions would you have envisioned?
I can take that. This one's an interesting one because it feels like I'm on the Prime Minister and the Immigration Minister's seat at the start of the pandemic and having to make that list. I would probably start off with the same list that they did, but what I would do differently is a more nimble approach to actually who gets in or out. That list would not be exhaustive, that the rules would not be as rigid and as strict as they are, that there would actually be more, case by case analysis done in applications. What we know is they could have done video interviews, for example. They could have enabled those if they had doubts about the seriousness or the genuineness of an application that would have allowed for family reunification, for example, thus allowing an applicant to overcome Section 179B, the one that we just spoke about earlier. What I saw as a practitioner during the pandemic and what was really frustrating, and it continues to frustrate me, is that oftentimes as an immigration lawyer and a refugee lawyer, you feel like you're talking to a wall. That's how it feels. And I suspect that if you open a window there to the government where you can actually talk to someone, whether you're a lawyer or a self-representing individual, this would facilitate a lot of things and prevent certain inequitable relationships or situations from spiraling out of control, such as, for example, when in 2021 there was a massive outcry for delays in family spousal and common law family reunification files that was very toxic at some point, that Will and I know that they were closely monitoring at that point. Will?
For me, I think it's not necessarily who, and I think Audrey mentioned it earlier, but the family class has been deprioritized for since whenever, right? So this is nothing that changed through the pandemic. But I think what the pandemic did was it kind of insulated, just like the visa offices closing their doors, to a lot of the decision-making processes and the social science foundations behind how those decisions are made. And for me, moving forward in the next pandemic, I would like to see a little bit more justification or rationale or stats or data, rather than just decisions made with no justification or limited justification.
I am persuaded by what Lou and Will said, and I'll only add one minor point, that if you're going to make exemptions, those exemptions should include people with a well-founded fear of persecution. Whatever mechanisms that we have for quarantining, for reducing the risks that are posed or faced by people who are coming from another country, we could and should bring those to bear on people who have a well-founded fear of persecution and are,
Thank you.
namely refugees.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Veronica Elias. I'm a research chair, Fulbright research chair with the Center on Governance here at the University of Ottawa. But I work at the University of Texas at San Antonio, so very far away. I have a question for Will, Tao. You mentioned that there is, I guess, a move towards the database decision making here, and with an increase in using social science evidence and rates and rankings. Increasingly used by government with very little transparency. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that. And I guess I want to hear your perspective on whether this is really a good thing and to what extent, and what's the room or leeway there for border patrol officers, for instance, or people at the border in terms of discretion, discretionary power and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. It's also really interesting that in Canada, we always have, Canada Border Services Agency, oftentimes with the administrative function of letting folks in, but maybe not having the same in-depth intel training that some of the, visa officers are getting internationally, where they study the stats and numbers. So there's a bit of disconnect there can often be between border decisions and visa offices. But one of my big concerns is, and unfortunately, I don't have the full picture, and we're only getting through it a bit through ATIPs, but we know the government has a risk tiering system. We know that they, tie things to such as GDP. And I think LJ can speak to that because he's looked into that of a country. They look at the refugee rates historically, but we don't know exactly how that decision is being made. And they're not being transparent with the foundations of what social science evidence is being discussed. So sometimes now in our cases, we're seeing them thrown into the decision, but with no reference to what source, where it's from, whether it's like a business magazine or, LinkedIn. Like we really don't know where the decision's coming from. And that is a fundamental challenge for applicants seeking entry, who we have our own evidence, but we're in a context of showing an applicant's going to leave Canada at the end of their stay. We're not necessarily in a position to throw in social science evidence and say, there's racism here involved, or, Canada's economy is going to be better for my client. Those are things that are going to hurt our clients oftentimes, right? So I'm just worried about that disconnect, and maybe I'll pass it on to one of you to add some more.
Lou, do you want to add to this, or Audrey?
I'm just on the point on the GDP. There was a mini study that I did a couple of years ago now. Incredible how time flies. That essentially ties that there is a correlation between a country's GDP per capita to visa approval rates in terms of study permits, for example. And for those interested, please reach out to me. I can share the slide deck to you and the data attached to it.
I did want to add just one more point about artificial intelligence decision making. Again, it's another area moving forward, but what the government is now doing with a lot of visas is they're looking at the individual's personal characteristics, their age, their marital status, their citizenship, just essentially extracting that bare minimum, and then they're making eligibility decisions just on that data. So the ability of discretion for them to actually read letters of support and get the whole picture of the narrative, that's diminishing as they want to make more efficient and quicker decisions. And what happens to those who do not, get that triage to approval? They are going to go and sit in probably a standard bin, waiting for an officer who's probably predisposed to refusing them because of knowing, that they have to perform this certain task of reviewing their situation. So there's definitely concern that these characteristics in this data is not, or is racist, and it also has some questionable foundations that haven't been challenged yet in court, and we don't have the data to challenge it either. So
thank you. May I invite the next question?
Do we have time for another question?
Oh, for sure.
Oh, we do. Okay, great. Hi, my name is Jeff King. I'm at University College London. So my question for each panelist actually is about what changes would you recommend, if you could, to the legislative framework that surrounds immigration? And it's not an academic question, because there are public inquiries going on in several countries, including the UK, which are taking recommendations on this. And I wanted to just ask, Audrey had mentioned one specific one about putting, having a well-founded fear of persecution on the list of exceptions. And I wondered what you'd say to the official that would say we have a regime for refugee protection already. What would your answer to them be? But I don't want, assuming that the refugee law still continues to apply in Canada. But I don't want your answer to that question to put you off indicating other amendments you'd propose. Thank you.
Jeff, can I just ask you to clarify? I'm sorry. Are you saying how would one reform the immigration system generally, or in its response to pandemics? I'm just trying to get a sense of the scope of your question.
Only in response. Any lessons from COVID-19 that you would suggest should lead to proposed amendments, even amendments that would be triggered in a subsequent pandemic scenario. They don't have to be permanent features, but the kinds of changes that could be put into place, for instance, through a declaration of a public health emergency.
I'll start answering, but the truth is I haven't tried to come up with that answer in a larger sense. So one of the things that pandemics do is, to the extent that they are understood as emergencies of some sort, they tend to legitimate channeling executive authority above and beyond what would normally be permissible. And one of the things that's distinctive about the way Canada dealt with the pandemic at the federal level is it relied on the Quarantine Act and not the Emergencies Act. And one of the reasons it relied on the Quarantines Act, in my view, I don't want to sound overly cynical, is precisely because the Quarantine Act is older and has many fewer mechanisms of accountability and oversight than does, surprisingly, the Emergencies Act. So structurally, I guess one thing I would say is that mechanisms in response to a pandemic should be, in legal terms, made holistic. To carve out the Quarantine Act and make it your main tool is to bring, in a sense, heighten the kind of lack of accountability and arbitrariness that is endemic to immigration law. I would prefer that the response, including immigration law, be housed in a more holistic way, in the hopes that that would require, generally speaking, a more deliberate, less arbitrary and accountable way. Now, with respect to refugees, all I'll say is that, what I was saying there is simply that people who meet the definition of a refugee, or people who are claiming refugee status, ought not to be barred on account of a pandemic when other people are being admitted, whether as citizens or as workers. That, as I said, the notable thing about the way in which refugee claimants were dealt with here is that the government didn't even feel the need to justify it. It wasn't as if there was a question of proportionality. It was as if we don't have to justify barring refugee claimants. We're just doing it. And that in itself strikes me as problematic. I don't know how far that gets toward your answer, but those are some really quick thoughts for a question that probably requires more thought on my part to give a full answer to.
Thank you.
Sure. Will,
Can I go first?
Oh,
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so I have two specific recommendations, and I actually also want to credit Will and in his capacity as part of an NGO, Arenas Foundation. We made submissions to the Standing Committee on Immigration and Citizenship, I think 2 years ago, Will, if I'm counting my years right, when we said that a temporary suspension of Section 179B that would allow for family reunification or enable family reunification was called for in that particular circumstance. I would like to see a nimble version of Section 179B enshrined and codified into the regulations. And in addition to that, I would also say a more robust dual intent provision in the Act itself under Section 22, paragraph 2. And what dual intent is, for those who don't dabble into immigration as we do, is that in Canada, when you're applying for to enter Canada, you're either a temporary resident or a permanent resident. You're allowed to have both intentions of being a temporary resident and permanent resident. That if you come in as a temporary resident, you also have plans of, or becoming a PR. Let's say, for example, you have a pending PR application in the works. A lot of times what we see is that if you have dual intent instead, is that your chances of getting your visa to come to Canada on a temporary basis becomes much harder. And I've heard, and I think Will was there when we've heard immigration officials themselves concede that the dual intent provisions of the Act need to be rethought in light of a lot of programs that we have, in light of Canada's use of a two-step migration process. In fact, a lot of new immigrants to Canada are indeed coming in as temporary workers or international students. So a codified, a robust dual intent regime would be appreciated. Will?
And on my end, it's actually a recommendation just recently, I think IRCC said that they're looking into, and also that Lou and I testified to in front of the parliament just this past year, but this independent ombudsperson, and it might be taking a bit of the long route, but just like we're gathered here today to do a bit of a post-mortem on COVID-19, I think one specifically needs to be done for immigration, and someone independent outside of the department that made the decisions can look in and say, here were the changes, here's what happened, here's what we did. Was it a correct decision in hindsight? What were some of the folks who fell on the other side of those decisions? And then publish that into a transparent report as a guiding framework for the next time this happens. I don't think it's enough just to amend regulations or policies, because I find during the pandemic and when things are rushed, and as Audrey was saying, they're going to find other ways to do so, or they're going to put in ministerial instructions, or just quickly program delivery updates, and things can shift without them actually having to go through proper regulatory impact assessment statements and frameworks like GBA. I think it's the time now to study what happened and to learn the lessons from this time and not make those same mistakes next time. I think that, as cliche as that sounds, it's probably what we should do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so there is another question that's posted online. So I'm going to read the question first, and I understand that Audrey, you have already provided some written response, but because the audience was not able to see it here, so I would just like to give you a chance to speak to that. But the question has to do with human smuggling. So it's about whether in Canada, whether there has been an increase in human smuggling as a result of the border restrictions, because that there has been some report of greater global smuggling, and both of refugee claimants and economic migrants. So I would just like to see whether there is any kind of documentation or observation on that front here in Canada.
I'll just repeat the answer I gave in writing, which is I haven't seen any research or data. That's not to say the phenomenon isn't happening. What I do know of is that quite apart from the pandemic, the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement shut down a route of regular entry for people seeking refugee protection across the Canada-US border. At the time that the government was considering this agreement, people warned that this would divert people into irregular routes of entry. It didn't happen for some time, but certainly eventually it did happen. And so what I described earlier about entries across Roxham Road and elsewhere are, I think, directly correlated or caused by the Safe Third Country Agreement. So once you bar entry at formal ports of entry, then effectively you create, you manufacture a job creation program for smugglers. And certainly that is what happened. What I don't, as people who are, for whatever reason, determined to enter, they find irregular routes. That's the space that smugglers will enter into and exploit. Whether this grew under COVID or not, I don't know. What I will say is that to the extent that under COVID, the Canadian government started turning people back from Roxham Road, one might assume that it drove people to more surreptitious, more clandestine, more dangerous, more hazardous, more risky, more lethal routes of irregular entry. And it would be plausible if smugglers got involved in that, but I haven't seen any data about it. So I can't actually answer the question.
But I think that's very helpful, because as we know internationally, there is some data around that, and it seems that for some refugee claimants who are forced to not being able to enter the country that they desire to go to. Sometimes there's some reports that suggest that during the past couple of years that they've tried more risky routes and often with the aid of smugglers. Thank you. I think our time is coming up, so I just want to give a chance for each of the panelists to provide perhaps some concluding remarks on the topic of the border and the impact of migrants during the pandemic. So perhaps I can just invite, Will, do you want to go first?
I need 30 seconds of this unexpected last question to think through. Maybe
just some concluding thoughts.
Sure. I'll think of something. I'm just reading through my paper again, just quickly thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my research moving forward, again, I'm a practitioner, so not a full researcher, although I am considering an LLM as a next step, just to let everyone know. That's why I flew all the way to Ottawa from here. Just, I'm really fascinated about, and immigration has released an internal handbook about a playbook, a policy playbook for where they want to go with decision making. And I think COVID-19 sped that up quickly because they realized following the pandemic, there's going to be a rush of folks coming to apply to Canada, and there has been in the stats. So what happens when all these folks apply, yet there's not enough individuals to actually individually process their applications? And now they realize they can actually function without these expensive visa offices abroad, or maybe they can get away with not appearing racist because they don't have a visa office in that country anymore. It's just a centralized computer. So I think that's what's fascinating me most about moving forward is I think if there is a next pandemic, of course this one's not over, but if there is a future one, I think a lot more machines will be making decisions on who's in and who's out and sorting, and how complex and how smart are these, intelligent are these machines when that happens, and does it codify a lot of the historical racist past that Canada has with respect to immigration, or does it learn from some of its lessons and input some discretion and provide exceptions and act with a level of compassion for what will be a robot? So I'm interested in that future and what that might look like for not only immigration, but for a lot of areas in law and in practice. It's the next revolution. So that's what I'm studying in my spare time.
Great, thank you. Lou or Audrey?
Audrey, do you want to go first or should I? Okay,
Please
thanks.
go ahead.
I mean, I don't really have a closing remark here, but what I would say is that, in terms of thinking of healthcare workers in the current pandemic, a lot of them are really working, beyond what we know of, like the risks that they had been exposed to and are still being exposed to at the front lines, is the precarity of their, status. Let's just focus on Canada, for example. A lot of them participate in the two-step migration process to become permanent residents and eventually citizens of Canada. A lot of them enter through programs that don't necessarily allow them to exercise the profession that they're trained in. What I'd like to see is a little bit more nimbleness on the part of government, both federal and provincial. And what I want to see is less finger pointing. I mean, obviously, this is a shopping list of what I want to ask from Santa this Christmas, right? The fact of the matter is they need to stop pointing fingers at each other and essentially talk to the stakeholders, talk to the people who are actually being affected by such antiquated processing of credentials assessment, for example, that make them jump through so many hoops. And then as a final point, I guess I want to say that no, I will not be pursuing an LLM, just like Will has said. I think my days of studying are done, but I am very interested in data, and I think Will and I will be working on a lot of things in the future. And I think the postmortem on the pandemic, when it's finally over, essentially is something that we will be studying for quite some time in the future.
I think that the only point I would like to make in closing is to say that Canada's immigration system has operated on a conceit, an elitist conceit about skill for a very long time. We prioritize the selection of economic immigrants over family or refugees because we think that performance in the labor market is the most important measure of who is a desirable future member. Within that category, we think people of high skill are more important than people with low skill and more valuable to us. And something that's always been, I think, a mistake, frankly. At least a kind of, this sort of human capital model has been crude and somewhat simplistic model of how immigration works, frankly, and how human patterns of migration work. But whether you agree with that or not, it so happens that the pandemic upended that, at least temporarily. And we were forced into the recognition that the people we need, absolutely need, are people who we have otherwise denigrated as unworthy of membership because they are not sufficiently skilled. If there was a way that we could actually take that lesson seriously, that's not just a lesson for the pandemic, it's a lesson for how we value people and think about people as future members, that would be, I think, a good thing. It doesn't mean that it generates easy or obvious answers for future immigration policy. Those are much bigger questions. But I think it is something that we would do well to think harder about and reflect more upon going forward.